January 1917. The world was bleeding, exhausted by a stalemate that had already claimed millions of lives. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson clung to a fragile neutrality, promising to keep American sons out of the European slaughterhouse. But in the shadows of the Atlantic, a single piece of paper was moving through the wires, a coded message that would shatter the peace of a continent. It was a proposal so audacious, so dangerous, that it seemed like a work of fiction. But was it a genuine threat or a calculated trap? The answer would force a superpower out of isolation and redefine the 20th century forever. By early 1917, the German Empire was suffocating under a British naval blockade. Desperation had set in. Arthur Zimmermann, the German Foreign Secretary, was a man of bold, often reckless vision. He knew that to win, Germany had to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking every ship in the Atlantic, including American ones. He also knew this would likely bring the United States into the war. To prevent this, Zimmermann conceived a shadowy plan, a distraction on the American doorstep. If Mexico could be persuaded to attack the United States, Washington would be too busy defending its own border to send troops to France. It was a cold, calculated gamble, a geopolitical chess move played with the lives of millions. Zimmermann drafted a telegram to the German minister in Mexico City outlining a secret alliance. He offered money, support, and a prize that no Mexican leader could ignore: the return of the lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The message was encrypted and sent into the ether, but Zimmermann had forgotten one thing. The British were listening. But how did they manage to catch a signal meant for the other side of the world? Deep within the old Admiralty building in London sat a secret department known simply as Room 40. Under the command of Admiral William Reginald Hall, a man nicknamed Blinker for his nervous tic, this unit of academics and linguists was the birthplace of modern signals intelligence. Since the start of the war, the British had cut Germany's undersea telegraph cables, forcing Berlin to rely on neutral lines or radio. Little did the Germans know, the British were tapping into almost everything. On January 16th, Room 40's cryptographers intercepted a message encoded in cipher 0075. As the letters were meticulously decoded, the room fell into a stunned silence. The text revealed the full extent of Zimmermann's treachery. It was the ultimate smoking gun, the evidence needed to pull America into the fight. But Admiral Hall faced a brutal dilemma. If he shared the telegram with President Wilson, the Germans would realize their codes were broken, and the Americans would realize the British were spying on their diplomatic traffic. The stakes were absolute. One wrong move could destroy the very alliance the British were desperate to build. So, how could they reveal the truth without exposing their greatest secret? It was a diplomatic tightrope that would require the skill of a master illusionist. Admiral Hall was a master of the long game. For weeks, he sat on the telegram, waiting and watching. He knew that simply handing it over would be a disaster for British intelligence. He needed a cover story, a way to make it look like the telegram had been stolen in Mexico rather than intercepted in London. While Hall waited, Germany launched its unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st. The tension in Washington reached a breaking point, yet Wilson still hesitated. He needed more than sunk ships. He needed proof of a direct conspiracy against American soil. Hall eventually found his opening. By obtaining a copy of the telegram from a commercial telegraph office in Mexico City, a copy sent in an older code, he could provide the Americans with the evidence they needed while keeping Room 40's secrets safe. This clean version allowed the British to claim they had simply found the message in Mexico. It was a brilliant piece of tradecraft, but would the Americans believe it? The question remained, would Wilson see this as a genuine threat or a British trick to lure him into the trenches? While London and Washington engaged in a shadow dance, What about the nation at the center of the proposal? Mexico was in the midst of its own bloody revolution. President Venustiano Carranza received the German offer with interest, but he was no fool. He assigned his generals to study the possibility of reconquering the American Southwest. The conclusion was swift and grim. Mexico was in no position to fight a war against its northern neighbor. They lacked the industrial capacity, the ammunition, and the stability to hold even an inch of American territory. Furthermore, the German promise of generous financial support was viewed with deep skepticism. Germany couldn't even get supplies to its own colonies, let alone ship gold to Mexico City. Carranza realized that a war with the United States would be a suicide mission. He officially declined the offer in April, but the damage was already done. The mere existence of the proposal was enough to set the world on fire. The Germans had attempted to play the Mexico card, but they had vastly underestimated the response it would trigger in the American heartland. But what would happen when the American public finally saw the text for themselves? On February 23, 1917, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, handed the telegram to the American ambassador. When the message reached President Wilson's desk, the effect was visceral. Wilson was a man of peace, a man who had spent years trying to mediate a settlement in Europe. To see his neutrality met with a German plot to dismember his own country was a personal and political betrayal. The evidence was undeniable. The Germans weren't just sinking ships, they were actively inviting an invasion of American soil. Wilson's administration spent the next few days verifying the authenticity of the message, but the president's mind was already changing. The isolationist wall he had built was beginning to crumble. He realized that the Atlantic was no longer a moat, it was a highway for German aggression. The message was then leaked to the press, and on March 1st it hit the headlines across the country. The reaction was like an explosion. But in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. Arthur Zimmermann himself stepped forward to speak. What he said next would shock everyone. When the telegram was published, many Americans, particularly in the isolationist Midwest, believed it was a British forgery. They simply couldn't believe the Germans would be so brazen. For a brief moment, it seemed the plan might backfire on the British. Then, Arthur Zimmermann did something inexplicable. During a press conference in Berlin, instead of denying the telegram, he admitted it was real. "I cannot deny it," he told a stunned reporter. His reasoning was that the alliance was only intended if the United States went to war first, but the nuance was lost on the American public. The confession was a catastrophic blunder. It silenced the skeptics and united the American people in a way nothing else could have. The Zimmermann telegram became a household name, a synonym for treachery. In cities across the country, German-American organizations were forced to declare their loyalty, and the sentiment for war reached a fever pitch. The hidden truth was now out in the open, and there was no going back. But was this the only reason the US entered the war? Or was it merely the final spark in a powder keg that had been filling for years? The momentum was now unstoppable. On April 2, 1917, Woodrow Wilson stood before a joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany. He spoke of making the world safe for democracy, but the shadow of the Zimmermann telegram hung heavy over the chamber. The threat to Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona had transformed a distant European conflict into a domestic emergency. Congress voted overwhelmingly for war. The entry of the United States brought a massive influx of fresh troops, limitless industrial resources, and a psychological boost that the exhausted Allies desperately needed. The German gamble had failed spectacularly. Instead of keeping America out of the war with a border conflict, Zimmermann had invited the full weight of the American military onto the Western Front. It was the beginning of the end for the Central Powers. The sleeping giant had finally awakened, and its arrival would ensure that Germany could never win the war of attrition. But what if Zimmermann had never sent that message? Would America have stayed out until it was too late? The Zimmermann telegram remains one of history's greatest what-if moments. Without it, the isolationist movement in the United States might have remained strong enough to block Wilson's call for war for several more months, perhaps long enough for Germany to knock Russia out of the war and pivot all its forces to the west. A German victory was not an impossibility in early 1917. But beyond the battlefield, the telegram changed the way nations conducted business. It proved that in the modern age, a secret is only as secure as the cable it travels on. It birthed the era of signals intelligence, leading directly to the creation of agencies like the NSA. It also marked the end of American innocence. The United States could no longer pretend that the oceans protected it from the dark games of European power politics. A single piece of paper, encrypted with a failing code, had fundamentally shifted the balance of power for the rest of the century. It was a brutal lesson in the consequences of secret diplomacy. And a reminder that in the world of shadows, one intercepted message can change the fate of millions. But the question remains, are we still living in the world that Zimmermann's blunder created? It was a brutal lesson in the consequences of secret diplomacy. And a reminder that in the world of shadows, one intercepted message can change the fate of millions. But the question remains, are we still living in the world that Zimmermann's blunder created? History is often decided in the dark, and the Zimmermann telegram is proof that the smallest details can have the loudest consequences. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows of the Great War, make sure to subscribe to the Eerie Historian. We explore the betrayals and scandals that the textbooks often overlook. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep questioning the stories they tell you. The truth is usually much darker.